Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom live on location in Bahama, North Carolina. Spelled Bahama, but we're not going to get into that whole thing right now because it's very confusing for you out-of-town people. All right, now look, going into it though, we're about to go ahead and kick off this flip. It's only going to take us about like 16, 17, 18, not more than 20 minutes to discuss the end of the Opium Wars in China, where we left off in class, talking about British imperialism. Then we're going to refocus a little bit on Japan, and then talk about India, and then talk about some reactions to imperialism a little bit as well. But we are going to cruise a little bit, and we're not going to dawdle on certain stuff. And as you can see, there's somebody behind me milling around in the background that wants to say hello to y'all real quick. So come here real quick, Mama. This is my mom. All right,
Good morning.
Mama Terry, as what some people refer to her as, but this is her. Say hello, AP.
Hello, AP.
Yeah, that.
Good luck.
See what I mean? Even she knows it's hard. All right, so now look, going into it though, let's pick up right where we left off in class. Right, we were talking about how opium was stupid illegal in China, but of course the British are going to ignore that and start selling it there willingly. Right? No, not there. We're going to do what they did. They're going to do what we did in class, where Ryan came out into the China Sea, and then I met her out there, and then we exchanged. It was all for tea, which is ridiculous. But going into it though, where we left off in class, we started talking about these things known as the Opium Wars, which were several iterations of these wars, right? There was the first Opium Wars and the second Opium Wars as well, that ranged from about 1839 to 1860. The causes of these wars are going to be, of course, British greed, trying to actually gain as much monetary value from those opium sales as they possibly could, seize chests, because what the Chinese response to this opium sale that's breaking through their Canton system and their closed economic system is going to be to seize the chests at ports and then destroy them. And then the British are going to get really upset because they're like, you destroyed our drugs, which is like one of the weirdest responses and one of the weirdest ways to start a war. Is, hey, you destroyed the illegal stuff we were trying to sell to you. Give us our money back. Absolutely insane, right? So this is, of course, all the East India Company and stuff like that doing this at this time. And also there's another weird cause. Bread. All right, so now that has to do with the second Opium War, though, because apparently there was a Chinese bakery that actually made tons of bread that would get shipped back to England, and apparently there was arsenic found in the bread, and so they used that as a motive to help start the second one. All right, but going into it, what you need to understand is that there's a common theme throughout both of these Opium Wars, right? That being that the British are going to totally overwhelm the Chinese, even though they were heavily outnumbered. Okay, the ratio of what we're looking at is almost a 10-to-1 outnumberment, right? You're talking about 6,000 British occupational troops that were going to be in China at the time during the Opium Wars against 50,000 Chinese soldiers, all right? How is it possible that 6,000 is beating 50,000 so efficiently? A lot of it has to do with technological innovation when it comes to military technology, right? You have to remember a couple of key things. You got to remember that there's a more advanced training for the British military at this point, because they have put so much of their cultural ethos, focus, and development into developing their military. Also technology, okay? Because the British are now using breech-loading rifles. They do not have the Maxim gun yet, okay? But they do have breech-loading rifles to the Chinese muskets, right? And also, many of the Chinese soldiers were still using bows, arrows, and swords, all right? Because they never actually needed to or required the advancement of that type, because they had the Qing dynasty in power, which was the longest up until this point ruling dynasty in China's history, being led by the Dowager Empress, right? And you have to realize when you're looking at that, if you don't have a motivation to develop military technology because you're not going to war, then you're never going to need to do it. Whereas the Europeans have been going to war every 30 seconds with each other, ranging all the way back to wars as soon as the 30 Years' War, and then even before those, when you have also small skirmishes and conflicts between all these different countries. And everybody's trying to race each other to build better weapons so they can kill each other more efficiently, and now the Europeans have the most advanced weaponry in the world at the time. And you also have to remember another one, this thing known as the HMS Nemesis, right, which showed up on the shores of China during the Opium Wars and was a steam-powered war vessel, all right? This thing literally was a steam-powered war vessel going up against Chinese boats that were still wind-driven, right? This is a Chinese vessel right there, as you can see, being completely wind-driven, and that right there, the HMS Nemesis, serves as a great comparison to the technological military gap that actually existed between these two parties, right? And as you can see right here as well, some of these Chinese soldiers are still using bows and arrows, and if they had guns at all, it was only a few of them, and they were sparse, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is because the British will so aggressively overwhelm the Chinese, it's going to lead to a series of treaties, right? And these treaties are going to be not formally known, but referred to as by the Chinese as the unequal treaties, right? Because what's going to end up happening is not only are the British going to be involved in these wars, okay? That's a really big thing about the Opium Wars you have to understand. That the French, the Russians, the Germans, like a little bit later down the road, are all going to start jumping onto this and piggybacking on it and actually trying to open up China's economic system, right? So they're going to start going into this and creating these things known as the unequal treaties, because the ones that are gaining so much are the Europeans, while the ones that are losing so much are, of course, the Chinese, right? And so these unequal treaties will actually establish these things known as the spheres of influence, okay? Now, this is a hard thing to understand, but I want you to try your best to wrap your mind around it. I'm sure my mom's going to be listening in the background right now and be like, what the heck does that even mean, all right? A sphere of influence that we're talking about when we're looking at the end of the Opium Wars was a product of these unequal treaties. Now, what a sphere of influence is I want you to imagine for a moment in the back of your mind that this map right here had bubbles on top of it, right? Had like little glass domes that went over certain areas of China. Because remember, China was a very prosperous trade empire, right? Had massive amounts of money, and they only allowed Westerners to go to one specific city known as Canton, which was located right down here towards what is now modern-day Vietnam, okay? But when we're looking at this, what's going to happen is because of the unequal treaties, the French, the Russians, and the English will create new established spheres, right? So what they're going to do is basically, I want you to imagine a glass dome gets sat down on top of each of those each of those cities, and it's like, oh, the Russians will be taking this one, all right? Or excuse me, where is the Russian one? Yeah, the Russians will be taking this area up here that is going to be actually disputed heavily when we get to Japan. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the Russians are going to take this area known in northern China as Manchuria. The Germans will take this area right here towards the basin of the Yellow River. We're going to see a lot of, you're going to see the British take over this right here, which is the Pearl River, and also Canton. The French are going to take over this area right here that is known as French Indochina, what is now modern-day Vietnam, right? Do we smell a reason why the Vietnam War started? When the French left and the Americans ran in because they were afraid of communism. So, like, you have to understand that right there, those spheres of influence, will have massive repercussions all the way down the road, leading up to as soon as the 1970s, right? So you're talking about huge, huge stuff. Those spheres of influence, though, is referring to the areas that each of those Europeans kind of gobbled up or took over. Do you see what I'm getting at right there? It's a sphere of influence, all right? Try your best to wrap your mind around that. I believe in you, and if you need any extra help with it, you know, email me, we'll figure it out. All right, so now, in this whole era that was actually set up by these unequal treaties and the spheres of influence is going to be known as the Century of Humiliation, okay? So there's about 100 straight years, ranging from about 1860 to 1960, actually going even further than that, because guess when, really quick, mama, what year do you think, really, really quickly, what year do you think that the British finally gave Hong Kong back to China?
2023.
2023, that is a terrible guess. That is an awful guess.
I was making a joke.
That's a terrible joke. We don't joke about history in this house. So yeah, what year do you think?
It was a joke.
It was okay. What year? Yeah, what year do you think?
I don't know.
1997. So they owned China's port of Hong Kong from 1839 to 1997. You're talking about 160 years. That is bananas because it doesn't belong to them. All right, now look. So that right there is a good example of like that century of humiliation, of like a lot of aggressive European involvement in Chinese affairs, right? Now, what's going to also happen with these spheres of influence is China will be formally, highlight this word right here, right there, they're going to be formally opened, is what it's called. Remember, their economic system was closed, and now it has been forcibly opened by, of course, the reigning queen at the time. This is all going to begin underneath the Victorian era, right? This is, of course, a picture of Victoria right there. This is a letter that was actually written to her to try and tell her to stop selling drugs in China, but apparently she never got it. All right, so now look, going into it, though, speaking of special guests, though, also, here's the other one that's, like, walking around the background. Daddy, come here real quick. Say hey real fast. This is my AP class I'm recording the lesson for. So real quick, we're continuing on that imperialism discussion though, but now we're hopping over the China Sea and we're actually going over to Japan real fast. And we're going to talk about how imperialism is going to affect Japan in the late 1800s, all right? So Japan is a really, really interesting one as well because they did the same exact economic approach that the Chinese did. They did this thing known as economic isolation or economic isolationism, which is the concept where it's like, oh, if you want to trade with us, you have to come to us. We are not going out to you, right? Because Japan had several different types of luxury goods as well that actually contributed to the growth and the wealth of the eastern reaches of the world at the time, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is that idea of economic isolationism is going to come head-to-head with something referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Now, this is an interesting little moment in time because we haven't really talked about the Americans being involved in anything, but America is going to get involved in this imperialism game using this thing known as gunboat diplomacy, right? So what happens is a man by the name of Commodore Matthew Perry rolls up to Japan in the late 1800s, and he is on a steam-powered war vessel, right? Massive steam-powered war vessel when he rolls up to the shores of Japan, and what's going to end up happening is... Oh, wait, sorry about that. Just texting something real quick. There we go. So what's going to end up happening, though, is that he actually threatens Japan to open its ports, right? He's like, either you have 1 year. He tells them you have 1 year to open your ports to foreign influence, or we're going to come back with more of these boats, and we're going to attack you. So basically, the Americans held a gun to the face of the Japanese, and they were like, hey, do this or else, which is insanity, right? And they do this actually right after their own civil war, which is bananas, right? So now, because this actually begins around the late 1860s. So what's going to end up occurring, though, is Japan, feeling forced and after witnessing what happened to China during the Opium Wars, feels that they had no other choice but to open up, right? And so what this leads to is a period in time in Japanese history known as the Meiji Restoration. So in Japan, before all this happened, before Matthew Perry shows up on his boat, before he shows up on this vessel and threatens them to open up their ports, they were ruled by what is known as the Tokugawa Shogunate, right? And the Tokugawa Shogunate is basically a feudal lord system being led by samurai warlords, right? So it's the daimyo system as well, is what it's also referred to as, interspersed within their history, all right? The daimyo is actually these larger like feudal lords, and then they went to war with each other, and there's this like Satsuma rebellion. Whole other thing, all right? So, but what you need to know is that the shogunate was ruling over Japan at the time. They didn't really necessarily, they had an emperor, but they wasn't very powerful, right? And so what ends up happening is they restore this idea under the emperor Meiji, right? And Meiji was very, very young at the time. There's a very young man. He starts ruling in 1868. And what he decides to do with a panel of advisors is rather than being imperialized, they might want to become the imperializers. So this is a huge effect of imperialism that Europe is putting onto the rest of the world, is that it even pushed Japan to follow suit with them and do the things the Europeans were doing. Now, this is an interesting little thing, because if we go back to this map real quick of the spheres of influence, you'll notice something key here. See Japan? Look at that purple color. They imperialized Korea. They also are going to go to war with the Russians over Manchuria as well, okay? So they actually decided to aggressively modernize, right? So the Japanese started sending out emissaries all over Europe and America, recruiting people to come over there and aggressively modernize their country, right? Massive industrialization, laid railroads, put up power lines, put up telegraph lines, brought in Western fashions and stuff like that. And it's going to lead to a Japan that when they had that like threat put against them, is they decided to immediately modernize and emulate Western style ideologies, which is wild, all right? And it's going to be very, very important that we know this, because yet again, just like what you need to know whenever you're going into the AP test, is those kind of lingering effects, right? This is what is going to bring them into the forefront. This is what's going to bring them into aggressive imperialization, and this is what's going to bring them into the World War II conflict later on, all right? Or it's the first step into it. Now, another big like theater that we have to discuss when we're talking about imperialism is, of course, Africa, which is arguably the saddest of all of them because of the genocide that will occur there, all right? So in Africa, what you're going to see when it comes to imperialism is I'm going to show you two maps real fast, right? That one map right there on the left and the one on the right. And what we're looking at is Africa in 1880, before the heavy proliferation, manufacturing, and creation of quinine medicine. And then you're going to see Africa as of 1914 there on the right. Now, looking over the one on the left, see everything in gray right there? Everything in gray is untaken territory and unimperialized territory by Europeans because they physically could not get there, and also because by the time that the quinine medicine showed up, it is going to have a time delay to actually trying to make sure you got there and actually used it effectively. But all that area in gray right there was unclaimed by Europeans. But look, a mere 30 years later, how much of Africa is left unimperialized, right? Only 2%. modern-day countries, right? By 1914, only 2 modern-day countries were able to survive imperialism in Africa. Everything else was claimed by the French. It was claimed by the British. It was claimed by the Germans. It was claimed by the Belgians, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, right? But the only 2 places that were actually left untouched was this place right here, known as Liberia, which was actually founded by former American slaves, and so America was like, don't touch that. And then also right here, Ethiopia, which is a really interesting story because the Italians tried to like imperialize them, but they actually resisted it and shot at them and won the war, all right? It's very, very cool, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So going into it, you have to understand, is Europeans wanted to begin to explore those uncharted, the gray areas in Africa right there. And so they started to begin to send explorers to these different uncharted areas, like David Livingstone in 1870, who actually got lost, sorry, and they didn't know what happened to him. They were like, oh no, David Livingstone is gone. So they sent this other man to go find him, named Henry Morton Stanley, who's one of the worst people in history. I hate him so much. If there is like literally a point where I'm gonna see people in the afterlife, I'm punching Henry Morton Stanley directly in his stupid mustache face. All right, so like, because he killed people for no reason. He would use literally African natives, mama, as target practice. Do you hear what I'm saying right now? It is ridiculous. He's a terrible person. I hope he burns aggressively his hand on a stove. So now, like, anyway, now really quick. Going into it though, Henry Morton Stanley is going to be there in 1876 to try and find David Livingstone, okay? So Henry Morton Stanley and David Livingstone are examples of explorers that were sent in there because of the modern advents of quinine medicine to discover these uncharted areas of Africa. But what's going to happen along the way is that people like David Livingstone and also Henry Morton Stanley are going to begin to realize that there is a ton, a plethora, a massive amount of raw materials that is inside of Africa and inside the African continent, including things like copper, gold, rubber, ivory, diamonds, palm oil, right? Palm oil going to be a massive thing that they're going to use to actually lubricate machines back in factories and stuff like that inside of Europe post-industrialization. So this is going to cause a huge race for this territory, right? When the reports begin to come back and books begin to be published by people like this, well, first of all, David Livingstone actually never made it out of Africa. He actually ended up getting sick and he died there. But Henry Morton Stanley ends up publishing several volumes of what he saw and observed while he was there, and he starts talking about all these different things that are there. And ivory was a big one at the time, right? Y'all, you know what ivory is, yeah, mama? It's what? It's like it's
Elephant tusk.
yes. Good job. Look at there go. See, it's elephant tusks, right? Why was ivory so expensive back in the day? Do you know? Like, why was it such like a hot commodity product? What did they make out of it?
Teeth.
You don't make teeth out of it. Why would you make teeth out of other like?
Jewelry.
No.
What? Piano keys.
Piano keys, right? Very good job. Look at her go. Tickling the ivories is why it's called
Ivory
that.
and ebony.
Yeah, Ebony. There you go. You got it. No, it's like, yeah. Anyway, look at her go. See, she knows so much about history. She's wicked smart. Adults have to know this stuff. All right. Now look. So going into it though, you have to understand that causes a massive race for this territory in Africa, known as the scramble for Africa. So whenever you hear that phrase, you need to highlight scramble for Africa. It's one of the most important things you'll ever hear, and it's one of the most awful things we'll ever talk about in this class. It is on par with other genocides that occurred throughout history, including things like the Holocaust, Sepoy Mutiny, the Boxer Rebellion, right? A lot of these different things, okay? So going into it, what you have to understand is that race for Africa, known as the Scramble for Africa, is going to lead to this thing known as the 1884 Berlin Conference, which is one of the most racist meetings that you've ever heard of in your entire life, all right? So the Scramble for Africa, its byproduct is going to look like this, right? Because everybody is trying to claim all this territory and get their slice of the pie. And so since to try and avoid international conflict, a man intervenes, right? That man being none other than Otto von Bismarck. This is his big, like, why did you do this for me? Like, I want to punch him because of this one as well. He's a lot bigger than I am, though. He was like 6'4". So look, going into it, you have to understand the 1884 Berlin Conference, which was called by Otto von Bismarck. What's going to happen here is it's going to be a meeting inside of Berlin where all the great European powers are going to come to the table, and they begin to literally split up the territory in Africa, which is really, really aggressive because they don't live there. And none of the African leaders were invited to this meeting whatsoever. And so the 1884 Berlin Conference, being led by Otto von Bismarck, will partition the areas in Africa and give it to the great power, or like the huge, large base powers of Europe, leading to this map of Africa right here in 1914, including French West Africa and the Belgian conquest of the Congo, right? Now, going into it, what you have to understand is there are going to be major effects of imperialism inside of Africa, which are going to be absolutely devastating to the African people. For example, they're going to force Christian conversion, and they're going to place like a new religion onto them that they never even asked for. And don't ever forget that poem right there. Now, I said this poem in class one time, and it goes, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. So this was a disgusting poem that was actually published in Punch magazine in like England at one point. And what it's getting at is that no matter what happens, we should not fear because our technology supersedes that of the people that we are imperializing. And so should we need to use deadly force? They just will, which is disgusting because you're just talking about threatening people that only have weapons that are made out of primitive, like, not primitive, but like only have weapons that are improvised, if you will, okay? Africans will try to resist them, right? There's one moment in southern Africa towards what is now the modern-day Zulu nation where 5,000 African soldiers went up against 50 British guys and 4 Maxim guns, and they were almost eradicated, right? So you have to understand the technological disparity between those two groups is going to be aggressive, and every time the Africans would try to resist, there would be large-scale loss of life. And now the biggest one that you need to remember, that you need to highlight this entire thing, is there was a huge genocide that occurred inside of Africa, where anywhere from 10 to 20 million people died because of the, like, what is known as the Belgian conquest of the Congo. Whenever you discuss or look at figures in European history that are terrible, awful, disgusting human beings, there are people like Maximilian Robespierre, there's Adolf Hitler, there's Joseph Stalin, there's a lot of Benito Mussolini, right? There are terrible, disgusting, inhuman people in history. And in Africa, it is more likely for a man to be named Adolf than it is for him to be named Leopold, all right? Leopold is considered the most blacklisted name in Africa because of the ruler of Belgium. Leopold II was the king of Belgium during the 1800s, and he led what is known as the Belgian conquest of the Congo. He went to the Berlin Conference and partitioned out a chunk in the middle just for Belgium because he wanted to be a big imperialist like all these other powers were, and he didn't like how his monarchy was a constitutional monarchy. So basically, he was a brat. And he goes over there, and he tries to take this stuff over. He is. He's such a little turd. There's a great book about him being an awful piece of crap person in history called King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, if any of you are interested. And so what ends up going into it, though, is he gets all upset about it, and he wants this area because he knows there's ivory deposits, and he wants to take it over. Now, they later discover rubber there, and what ends up happening is King Leopold leads a violent conquest of Africa that ends up using slave labor in Africa to harvest all of these goods. And it ends up leading to the death of anywhere from 10 to 20 million people in Africa. Because the motivation or the way that they would do it is they would literally take African people hostage and then force their family members to go harvest these items. So, for example, during the rubber terror is what it was referred to as, during the latter part of the 1800s and 1900s, going into the actual World War I conflict, they would literally use African soldiers, known as the force publique, right, that had been forced to carry a gun and threaten other Africans to take hostages, and they would tell them to fill certain canisters or containers with rubber vine sap so that it could be made into rubber because it was becoming a very hot commodity to make rubberized tires for vehicles after John Dunlop invented the intertube tire, right? And if they refused to do it, right, they would then, like, basically, attack them, execute them, like forcefully, torture them in front of their own people. And there was a very famous thing that happened as well. This political cartoon, being one of the most famous that came out, is in the rubber coals. As you can see, that there's an African man with his family running away, and King Leopold is a rubber python strangling him. And this was another terrible thing that happened as well in Africa, is that the force publique soldiers, if you gave a gun to an African man at this time, he is typically going to want to use it to hunt with, right? And so the thing that's going to end up happening, though, is they told them, I'm going to give you 6 bullets. When you come back, you better have 6 bullets, or for every single bullet you shot, you must bring proof that you killed someone. So what these force publique soldiers would sometimes do is they would shoot the gun, and then they would have the bullet casing, and then they would cut the hand off a living human to try and use it as proof that they killed someone when they had actually not. So you're going to see torture, genocide, and a disgusting rain actually go over the Belgian area in Africa. It's absolutely awful, and we will talk about it more when I'm in class, okay? But now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about India, but we're going to leave that up to our next flip, all right? I'll see y'all soon. We'll talk about it soon. I'll see y'all in a little while. Y'all have a good one.